Achim Albrecht was born on July 2, 1962, in the city of Münster in the North Rhine-Westphalia region of Germany. It's a place known for tradition, discipline, and a strong cultural identity, elements that, in many ways, helped shape the determined mindset he would later bring into sports. Over the years, Achim would become known worldwide first as a professional bodybuilder, competing on the biggest IFBB stages, and later as a professional wrestler under the ring name Brockus. That kind of career shift was anything but common or easy. After all, bodybuilding and pro wrestling are completely different worlds, each with its own physical, mental, and technical demands. What makes his journey so unique is exactly that extreme transition. Very few athletes have managed to step away from elite-level bodybuilding and seriously pursue a place in American pro wrestling during the 1990s, one of the most competitive and aggressive eras in the business. Achim didn't just try. He made it to the biggest promotions, including WWF and ECW, facing established names and experiencing peak global exposure. Physically, Albrecht was impossible to overlook. His body was massive, thick, and intimidating, standing out even among other giants. But one feature rose above everything else: his quadriceps. They were so large and dense that they became his trademark, later being recognized by Flex magazine as some of the best quads in the history of bodybuilding. But before becoming a well-known name in the global bodybuilding scene, Achim Albrecht followed a very different path than most people might expect. In his youth, he was involved in several sports, but two stood out in a major way: rowing and weightlifting. Both demanded endurance, raw strength, and, above all, discipline, three pillars that would later define his career. Rowing, in particular, helped develop a wide back, powerful legs, and strong cardiovascular conditioning. Weightlifting, on the other hand, built a solid foundation of maximal strength, coordination, and body control. Even without realizing it at the time, Achim was already laying the groundwork for an extraordinary physique. This combination of sports shaped not just his body, but his mindset as well. Long, repetitive, and brutally demanding training sessions created an athlete who was comfortable with discomfort and pressure, and that makes all the difference at the highest levels of competition. In 1985, Achim made a crucial decision. He walked away from his previous sports and committed fully to competitive bodybuilding. From that point on, everything changed. It was no longer just about strength. It became about hypertrophy, symmetry, and muscular volume, all focused on creating maximum visual impact on stage. That moment marks the true birth of Achim Albrecht, the bodybuilder. By the late 1980s, Achim began putting everything he had built in the gym to the test. He started competing in regional and national contests across Germany, facing experienced athletes with already established physiques. This was when years of quiet, relentless work were finally exposed under the bright lights of the stage. From his very first appearances, one thing was obvious: Achim wasn't just another competitor. His size, muscle density, and stage presence grabbed attention instantly. While many athletes were still searching for the right balance between mass and aesthetics, he already stood out for sheer visual impact, especially in the heavier divisions. The real turning point came in 1989, when Achim won the International German Bodybuilding Championships. He didn't just take the heavyweight class, he also won the overall, beating every other category champion at the event. Winning the overall meant more than just a trophy. It was the highest form of recognition in the German bodybuilding scene and a clear signal that he was ready for something bigger. From that moment on, Achim was no longer seen as just a local prospect, but as an athlete with real potential to shine beyond Germany. Those victories opened the door to the international IFBB stage. Invitations, visibility, and new opportunities started to appear. Then came 1990, the most decisive year of his career. After dominating the national scene, Achim stepped onto the stage of the IFBB World Amateur Championships, better known worldwide as Mr. Universe, held in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. There, the best amateur physiques on the planet faced off, all chasing the same goal: earning a place among the elite of the sport. Competing in the division over 90 kilograms, that's over 200 pounds, Achim went up against extremely well-rounded athletes from different countries and training systems. Even so, his physique stood out right away. The mix of sheer size, muscle density, and solid structure caught the judges' attention from the very first comparisons. It was impossible to ignore that German athlete standing center stage. When the results were announced and Achim was crowned Mr. Universe 1990, his life changed overnight. That title wasn't just another medal. It was the official passport to professional bodybuilding, the stamp that proved he was ready to compete with the biggest names in the world. From that moment on, Achim was on the radar of IFBB officials, sponsors, and industry insiders. His name started circulating beyond Europe, reaching the United States and the backstage circles of major competitions. The kid who once trained in rowing was now a world champion. But winning Mr. Universe is really just the beginning of a whole new battle. The big question was unavoidable. How would he hold up face-to-face with the established monsters of professional bodybuilding? In 1991, Achim Albrecht made a decision that would permanently reshape his career. He moved to the United States, the epicenter of the bodybuilding world. Not long after, he signed a contract with Joe Weider, the most powerful man in the IFBB at the time. That meant access to the biggest stages, the best infrastructure, and, of course, the most brutal competition the sport had to offer. Right in his debut at the biggest event on the planet, he showed he wasn't there by accident. At the 1991 Mr. Olympia, Achim finished ninth, going up against absolute legends from the Golden Era and the early rise of the Mass Monster era. For a newcomer to the pro scene, that result was a clear sign of potential, but also a warning of just how extreme the level really was. His best performance came the following year at the 1992 Arnold Classic, where he secured an impressive fourth place. That result firmly put Achim on the map as one of the standout names of the decade. In the years that followed, he remained a consistent presence at major events, competing at the Arnold Classic, Mr. Olympia, and several pro shows, including 2 third-place finishes in 1995 at the Houston Pro and the Niagara Falls Pro. Beyond the stage, Achim also made his mark off it. He began writing articles for magazines like Flex and Muscle and Fitness, sharing insights on training, nutrition, and muscle building. That helped solidify his image not just as a competitor, but as someone who genuinely understood the sport on a deeper level. Eventually, though, his body started to push back. A serious biceps injury disrupted his preparation and consistency. From there, results became less predictable, and his motivation to continue in professional bodybuilding slowly faded. Faced with that reality, Achim began looking toward a completely different path, one where he could use his physique in a new way. In 1996, Achim Albrecht made what might have been the boldest decision of his entire career. He left professional bodybuilding behind and transitioned into pro wrestling. At that point, his physique still turned heads everywhere he went, and that opened the door to a new possibility. After all, very few athletes had a body as massive and intimidating as his. The opportunity came fast. Achim signed with the World Wrestling Federation, WWF, the biggest wrestling company in the world at the time. On paper, he looked like the perfect project, a former Mr. Universe, huge, European, and physically imposing. But in wrestling, size alone doesn't guarantee success, and Achim was about to learn that the hard way. To prepare, he entered an intense training program under Tom Pritchard and none other than Bret Hart, 2 key figures in shaping well-rounded professional wrestlers. Training alongside him were other up-and-coming athletes, including Mark Henry and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, who would later become legends of both wrestling and entertainment. The training environment was brutally competitive. Some adapted quickly to the rhythm of the ring, while others struggled to turn raw strength into technique, timing, and storytelling. And Achim, coming straight from bodybuilding, had to completely relearn how to use his body. The transition had begun, but the real test was still ahead. The crowd, the ring, and the pressure of the WWF spotlight. Achim Albrecht's pro wrestling debut took place on November 30th, 1996, during a WWF house show. That night, he stepped into the ring under the name Argo, still in a trial phase and far away from TV cameras. It was his first real contact with a live audience, the moment when all that training finally had to work in real conditions. Not long after, the company decided to rebrand him. Achim became Brachus, a character inspired by classic movie villains, designed to emphasize raw power and intimidation. The name fit his massive frame perfectly, but the character itself was still far from fully defined. It was all part of an experimental phase. During this early period, Bacchus worked almost exclusively in house shows and dark matches, facing wrestlers who were also hovering around the mid-card scene. He shared the ring with names like Dr. X, Tony DeVito, Rockabilly, the Sultan, Salvatore Sincere, and the Jackal. These matches were less about exposure and more about learning, testing his progress and adapting to the ring. In 1997, the WWF tried to take things a step further. Vignettes began airing, presenting Bacchus as a dangerous force from Germany, big, powerful, and ready to destroy anyone who stood in his way. In these promos, he even called out established stars like Vader and Triple H, building anticipation among fans. But the real push never came. Despite the initial setup, Bacchus didn't receive consistent television exposure. His character remained stuck between promise and uncertainty, while the WWF itself was going through major creative changes. By late 1997, the WWF made a strategic move, sending Achim Albrecht to Extreme Championship Wrestling, ECW. The idea was simple, but risky. Put him in a tougher, more intense environment to speed up his in-ring development. If he could survive there, maybe he'd be ready for WWF television. In ECW, Achim became part of the Right Connection stable, alongside Doug Furnas, Phil LaFawn, and Droz. The group was presented as a WWF extension invading ECW territory. Within that storyline, Bacchus played the role of the enforcer, someone who commanded respect more through physical presence than refined technique. His gimmick leaned hard into that concept. He came to the ring wearing a shirt that read, "Property of the WWF," was announced as hailing from Stamford, Connecticut, and even draped a WWF flag over defeated opponents. Everything was designed to provoke the ECW crowd, famous for being hostile toward anything seen as corporate. The peak of this run came at SummerSlam 1998, when Bacchus challenged Taz for the ECW World Television Championship. The match stood out because of the contrast, raw power versus pure technique. At moments, Achim managed to impress with his strength, delivering impactful moves that briefly energized the crowd. But the finish made the skill gap painfully clear. Taz quickly shut him down and won by submission in just a few minutes. That match perfectly summed up Achim's wrestling dilemma. Size and strength alone weren't enough. After his ECW stint, Achim Albrecht returned to the WWF in March 1998, carrying the hope that the brutal ECW experience had fast-tracked his development. Soon after, he finally made his official TV debut, something every wrestler aims for. It happened on Shotgun Saturday Night, but the outcome was disappointing, a loss to Goldust. Even so, the WWF continued searching for a role for Bacchus. That's how he ended up involved in one of the most controversial experiments in company history, Brawl for All. Unlike traditional wrestling, this tournament was completely real. No scripts, no choreography. Fighters were actually fighting. For someone coming from bodybuilding, this was an enormous risk. In the first round, Achim faced Savio Vega. The fight was rough, chaotic, and nothing like what he had trained for. Without the safety of performance-based wrestling, the match ended with Vega winning, and Bacchus suffering serious knee and shoulder injuries. Years later, reports surfaced claiming Achim didn't even fully realize at first that the tournament would be entirely legitimate. Despite being injured, he still got one final chance to make an impact. In July 1998, he earned his only televised WWF victory, defeating Jesus Castillo Jr. in a quick match. It was a brief, almost symbolic moment, but it marked the end of his WWF run. That period made one thing clear: poorly calculated decisions can permanently alter a career. Brawl for All didn't just end Bacchus' momentum, it damaged his body in a lasting way. In 1999, Achim Albrecht made one last effort to stay active in pro wrestling. After leaving the WWF, he briefly worked the Canadian independent circuit, including a stint with the legendary Stampede wrestling promotion. It was a final attempt to find space away from the pressure of major companies. By then, Achim was no longer the same physically. The accumulated injuries, especially to his knee and shoulder, limited his movement and hurt his performance. For someone who relied so heavily on strength and physical presence, any restriction made a massive difference. His body was clearly sending one final message. It was running out of fuel. Beyond the physical pain, there was a heavy psychological toll as well. The transition from bodybuilding to wrestling hadn't worked out the way he hoped, and real opportunities were disappearing fast. In a business where youth and durability matter a lot, Achim found himself drifting further and further away from any real progress in the ring. Given that reality, the decision became inevitable. In 1999, Achim Albrecht officially announced his retirement from professional wrestling. His in-ring career was short, only a few years, but it will always be remembered for its bold attempt to cross the line between two completely different sports. After stepping away from the ring, Achim had to reinvent himself yet again. Away from the spotlight of both bodybuilding and pro wrestling, he chose to turn all that hard-earned experience into something lasting. That's when he became a certified personal trainer through ISSA, one of the most respected fitness organizations in the world. Achim settled in California, one of the global hubs of the fitness industry. There, he began working hands-on with training, nutrition, and athletic preparation, coaching everyone from everyday gym-goers to athletes looking for serious physical development. This time, the goal wasn't competition anymore. It was teaching. Everything he had lived through in professional bodybuilding now became practical knowledge. Achim applied real-world lessons about muscle building, strength, discipline, and consistency, helping his clients avoid the same mistakes he had experienced during his own career. Few people were more qualified to guide others than someone who had stood on the biggest stages in the world. More than just workouts, he started passing on mindset. Consistency, respect for the body's limits, and proper recovery became the core pillars of his approach. Even away from the media spotlight, Achim remained connected to the sport, quietly, constructively, and with purpose. When you look at Achim Albrecht's full journey, it's clear his name occupies a very specific place in sports history. He's remembered as one of the most massive bodybuilders of the early 1990s, an athlete who immediately impressed with sheer size, muscle density, and stage presence. In an era filled with giants, he still managed to stand out. His Mr. Universe title remains the absolute peak of his bodybuilding career. That achievement placed him among the best in the world and secured his place in IFBB history. Very few athletes ever reach that level, and even fewer manage to compete on the biggest professional stages for multiple years in a row, as Achim did. At the same time, his name also became a classic example of how difficult it is to transition between sports. His move from bodybuilding to wrestling proved that raw strength and an extreme physique aren't enough when technique, timing, and storytelling come into play. His story is often cited as a cautionary tale for athletes considering the same path. Still, Achim's legacy isn't one of failure, it's one of boldness. He had the courage to try something most wouldn't, faced real challenges, and paid a high price for that decision. And that alone makes him a memorable figure. Achim Albrecht's story shows that not every great career is built only on victories, but on brave choices, real risks, and lasting consequences. He reached the very top of world bodybuilding, pushed beyond his limits, and experienced both sides of athletic success. Now I want to hear from you. What stood out the most in this journey? His insane physique at the peak of bodybuilding? The bold move from the stage to the ring? Or the risks of pushing the body to the extreme? Drop your thoughts in the comments. It really helps the channel and adds depth to the community discussion. If this video brought you information, reflection, or simply kept you hooked until the end, hit the like button. It makes a huge difference in helping this content reach more people. And if you're not subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss upcoming videos about bodybuilding legends, lesser-known stories, and the behind-the-scenes side of the sport. Want to support the channel even more and be part of an exclusive group? Become a channel member. And before you go, don't miss this. On the end screen, there's another video from the channel that connects directly with this story. Click it now and keep the journey going with us. See you in the next video.